This is a lecture on freedom's boundaries at home and abroad, 1890 to 1900. These are the learning outcomes for this lecture. First, we'll identify the origins and significance of populism. Second, we'll identify how the liberties of blacks after 1877 gave way to legal segregation across the South. Third, we'll analyze ways the boundaries of American freedom grew narrower in the 1890s. And finally, we'll discuss how the United States emerged as an imperial power in the 1890s. Your book begins talking about the Homestead steel strike. And really what's at stake here is two different American ideas of freedom in collision. There's the employer's definition of freedom and employees, workers' definition of freedom. So employers' definition was the idea that property rights, unrestrained by union rules, unrestrained by public regulation, were the thing that sustained the public good, were the thing that made you free. In other words, I can do what I want with my business and nobody can tell me to do anything with it, not provide a safe working environment, not pay living wages, not pollute, whatever. Opposed to that is the workers' idea. The workers' idea stressed economic security and independence from what they considered to be the, quote, tyranny of employers. And it was this idea that you could only be free if when you went into work, you were paid a living wage, you had some control in what you did all day, that you were, not oppressed to the point where all you could do is work and go home, work and go home. And so really that kind of sums up the two ideas of freedom that are colliding during this time period, because as we know, the definition of what freedom is not something that's fixed. It's something that's debatable and something that's in flux. So the Homestead Steel Strike is going to take place in Homestead, Pennsylvania at Andrew Carnegie's steel mill. At the steel mill, there was a union called the Amalgamated Association. And this union gave workers there a moderate say in how the plant was operated. Well, in 1892, Carnegie and the local supervisor at Homestead, a guy named Henry Clay Frick, decided that they were now going to operate the plant on a non-union basis. And they began to require their employees to sign yellow dog contracts. So a yellow dog contract is a contract that you sign that says you promise never to join a union. So if the workers wanted to continue working at Homestead, they had to sign this agreement promising not to join a union. Now, in response to this, the workers went on strike and they blockaded the steelworks so that Carnegie couldn't send in strike breakers. One of the things was they would say, because a lot of these are non-skilled jobs, if you went on strike, they'd just bus in people to work for you and take your job and say, fine, you quit, right? So to prevent that, the workers were blockading the steelworks so that the strike would be effective. In response to this, on July 6th, 1892, the armed strikers are going to confront 300 what are called Pinkertons. Pinkertons were like a private, they were the Pinkerton Detective Agency, basically private security force, right? And so these armed Pinkertons show up, there's a confrontation, 7 workers and 3 Pinkertons are killed, and the strike continues. 4 days later, on July 10th, 1892, the Pennsylvania governor decides to side with Carnegie, surprise, surprise, and he sends in the state militia of 8,000 soldiers to forcibly open the plant on management's terms, and the Amalgamated Association was destroyed. And so what this event showed was that neither a powerful union nor public opinion had the power to influence the conduct of the largest corporations in America. And indeed, it shows you kind of the asymmetry of power, right? That despite the fact that the support had wide support locally, that the government held a monopoly on force, and they could just send in the army, and they did send in the army to back up what is a labor dispute between a company and its workers. And so in the 1890s, many Americans began to believe that they were being denied economic independence and democratic self government. And a question for you is, were they right? Um, if democracy means rule by the people for the ordinary person, and you see the state coming in a labor dispute, in a contract, right, using the military to force the plant to open up and to force people to work for conditions they don't want to, is that democracy? And another question is, has this changed in America? Is the government actually working for the benefit of the average person, or does the benefit side on the side of the wealthy and the powerful? So at the top of the slide, you see our learning outcome. We are going to identify the origins and the significance of populism. So let's go at the turn of the century. Farmers are facing increasing economic insecurity. To some extent, being a farmer was always economically dicey, but problems for them are going to be intensifying during this time period. Sharecropping is going to remain the paradigm in the South. By the time we get to 1900, 50% of whites and 75% of blacks are going to be sharecroppers in the South. And they will be trapped in kind of perpetual poverty with cotton prices falling every year. So it's already bad and it just keeps getting worse. In the West, the high cost for railroad shipping, high interest rates, and deflation are all going to combine to make life very difficult for Western farmers. So because of all these problems, the farmers are going to seek to improve their condition first through something called the Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliance were founded in Texas in the 1870s, and it soon spread throughout the West and the South. And it proposed that the federal government establish warehouses where the farmers could store their crops until they were sold free of charge, and to issue loans at low interest rates to farmers. And this plan was sometimes called the Sub-Treasury Plan. And so that kind of goes nowhere, and eventually this gets picked up, these ideas get scooped up into a new political party. And this is called technically the People's Party. That's technically the party's name, but we more commonly refer to them as the Populists. So the People's Party, or the Populist Party, emerged from the Farmers Alliance in the 1890s. And it attempted to speak to all the producing classes, right? So for the farmers, for the workers. And it does win support in Western states, most of all in the cotton and the wheat belts. But they're never going to quite take off in urban areas. So this is primarily going to remain a Western Farmers Party, which is the main reason why it's so short-lived, right? It doesn't really take off in the South for racial reasons. It doesn't really take off in the North for workers. So this is primarily a Western Farmers Party. Now the Populists will embark on a remarkable effort of community organization and education before these things were popular, right? Real grassroots movement before Twitter, right? So this was a last try to envision America as a commonwealth of small producers. As we know, small producers are on out. Corporatization is what's coming in. And this was the last gasp of small farmers to try to that small independent producer. And they argued that freedom rested on the ownership of productive property and the respect and dignity of labor. And that was more akin to what this definition used to be. But as we saw in the last chapter, that definition of freedom has increasingly been shifted to this idea of unregulated market capitalism. So populists embraced modern technologies, the railroad, telegraph, and the national market, and they pushed the federal government to regulate them in the public interest. And so their platform in 1892 really is kind of this classic document of American reform. It argued that the forces harming the republic were political corruption and economic inequality. Sound familiar? A lot of the same stresses at the turn of the last century are very familiar to the first years of the Trump administration, the first Trump administration. A lot of the same issues. So their platform was a very long list of proposals that they hoped would, in their view, restore democracy and economic prosperity. And keep in mind that the Populist Party is very short-lived. Most of this stuff doesn't get done by them, but many of these ideas are taken over by the progressive reformers and passed later on. So one idea they had was the direct election of U.S. senators. Prior to this, if you read the original Constitution, senators were chosen by state legislatures. Now, of course, the populists do not get this, but the progressives do. This is achieved through the 17th Amendment, where now senators are elected by the popular vote of their state. And this was aimed at getting at corruption. There was this feeling that politicians were beholden to corporate interests, and if state legislatures, if other politicians are picking the politicians, they're just going to be picking people equally corrupt as them. So the hope here was to have the people hopefully choose people that are not beholden to these corporate interests. Another idea in the platform was a graduated income tax. This idea of, there being a tax on your income and that rich people would pay more than poor people would. And this gets achieved also by the progressives with the 16th Amendment. And this was meant at attacking economic inequality. This idea that the very, very rich, once they hit a certain level, they need to pay more money, and we can use that money to help lift up lower class people, right? By providing, education, providing clean water, providing healthcare, providing infrastructure, this kind of thing. They also called for the protection of labor unions. We do see some progress for that in the progressive era, and then it kind of takes a back seat again. And radically, they call for the nationalization of the railroads. In other words, for the state to take over the railroad. The railroad no longer be privately owned. Instead, the United States government would own the railroads. And unsurprisingly, because the railroad robber barons were very rich and very powerful, that doesn't happen. But you can see that this was, this was an idea that was out there. So if you need to pause this lecture, please do so now. So the Populist Coalition was, the Populists made remarkable efforts to try to unite black and white small farmers on a common political and economic program. But And there's limited success of that happening in the West, but it's a non-starter in the South. Most white Southerners were resistant to the populist message because of racism. Many African Americans refused to abandon the party of Lincoln. They refused to, they continued to vote Republican, while others were attracted to the populist program. But for most whites in the South, Democrats will maintain control by mobilizing white voters with fears of, quote, Negro supremacy. And so that was the line that they put. If you vote for the populists, you're voting for, quote, Negro supremacy. And that was a non-starter for most Southern whites. There was also a lot of voter intimidation, a lot of fraud that was perpetuated in the South to prevent the populist message from really taking hold. We'll also see the populist movement engaging the energies of, thousands of reform-minded women that had farm and labor backgrounds. This is particularly true in the West, where the populists were the strongest. For example, Mary Elizabeth Lease was a prominent organizer and the first female lawyer in Kansas. She was a big populist organizer. And you also see this playing out with suffrage, right? Thanks in part to the populist movement in the 1890s, women's suffrage will be secured both in Colorado and in Idaho far sooner than it is in the South or in the North. You do have some populist presidential candidates, such as James Weaver, who will win over 1 million votes. And you do have a populist governor elected in Kansas. His name was Lorenzo Lewingun, who was the governor. Now, despite all this, the populists, again, are going to remain a Western thing. They're not really going to take off with labor, despite taking up some issues labor supported. And part of it is you have to put what's going on in context, right? The 1890s are a really disruptive time for labor relations. In 1893, a severe depression hits the country. This is the Panic of 1893. And that is going to lead to increased conflict between capital and labor. And whenever that conflict happens, surprise, surprise, state and federal government almost always sided with the owners and would use the power and the violence of the state to suppress labor activities. An example of this is Coxey's Army. Coxey's Army was led by an Ohio businessman named Jacob Coxey. In May of 1894, they were marching to D.C. to demand economic relief in the wake of this depression, and federal soldiers were deployed to break up this band and, used force to forcibly dispel them. And there you can see a picture of what they looked like, and notice the children there, right? Another example of, the state putting its thumb down on the side of business was the Pullman strike of 1894. This was a big railroad strike that eventually the state breaks up, and the labor leader, Eugene V. Debs, was jailed for violating the judicial order that ordered the strike to end. He refused to end the strike, and he got arrested. And that gets challenged in court, and it goes up to the Supreme Court. That's the In re Debs SCOTUS case. And in it, the Supreme Court confirmed the sentence and upheld the injunction. So Debs goes to jail. He does emerge as a hero, though, and you'll see him being a thorn in the government's side for a long time. So the populists did make efforts to appeal to industrial workers, but ultimately they're going to fail to get labor support. What we're going to see is working class voters in 1894 shift en masse to the Republicans rather than to the populists, and the Republicans will ultimately take control of the House of Representatives. Now, the Republicans are going to run on raising the tariff, which is something the populists would be against, because remember, tariffs hurt agriculture. And the Republicans were successful in convincing workers that a high tariff would help manufacturing and protect jobs. And to a certain extent, I suppose they're kind of right. Like most things, it's complicated. But it also does hurt consumers, right? Because a high tariff means you have to pay higher prices for things. In any event, the populists will never gain the support of labor and will remain primarily a Western party until it just kind of eventually fizzles out. So if you need to pause this video to catch up, please do so now. This leads us to the election of 1896. The main issue in this election is something called free silver, and it has to do with the gold standard. So let me briefly explain what we mean by the gold standard, what inflation and what deflation are, because these terms are kind of central to this. Okay, so after 1876, the United States goes back onto what's called the gold standard. Today, the United States is not on the gold standard. Today, the United States currency is what's called floating. So its value can go up or go down, right? But during this time period, it's on the gold standard, which means that the dollar is tied to a specific amount of gold, and you have to have as much gold as you have dollars. So just to make it simple, let's say 1 ounce of gold equals $1. It was less than that, but just to make things easy. So if the federal bank had 100 ounces of gold, you could have $100, not $1 more, not $1 less. Okay. What that was doing was leading to deflation. Now, inflation and deflation are economic terms, and they have to do with the money supply. So it's hard to think about it this way, but money is a commodity, just like everything else is, just like corn is, just like broccoli is, right? And it follows the same laws of supply and demand as all commodities do. Now, you understand the laws of supply and demand, even though you don't know you understand the laws of supply and demand. So think about it. If I had a magic wand, and it was a real magic wand, and it could do Harry Potter magic, and it was the only one like it in the world, and I was going to sell it, you would have to give me a lot of money for it, right? Because supply is low, so demand is high, so price is high. Now, if this wand wasn't magic at all, it was, just a stick from a tree, and they fall from the trees, and we step on them, and in the fall they're everywhere, and I'm trying to sell one, you were probably not going to give me very much money for it. Why? Because supply is high, so demand is low, so price is low. So money is the same thing. When there's lots and lots and lots of money out there, that is called inflation. And it means the value of money is less. And this is why when there is inflation, the prices for things go up, because you have to give me more money for the same good or service, okay? Now, inflation is bad for businesses and bankers. They don't like that because it means that they're getting paid, the value of the money being given to them is worth less than maybe they spent, okay? So it's bad for it's bad for creditors, for banks, it's bad for businesses. It's very, very good for debtors, okay? If you're in debt, you want inflation because it means the money you're paying back is cheaper than the money you borrowed, okay? Deflation is when there's not enough money in the economy. Money is more expensive and harder to get a hold of. And so what we see during this time period is a lot of deflation. And farmers who are in debt are struggling. It's harder for them to make their payments. Money is more expensive than when they borrowed it, right? So what farmers really want is inflation, because that should make farm prices rise. But you can't inflate the currency if you are on the gold standard, right? Because there's only so much gold. So this is where they're at. All right. So the two guys that are running for president in 1886, and by the way, they're going to repeat this exact same scenario in 1900 to the same results, are William Jennings Bryan, who's running as a Democrat, and William McKinley, who's running as a Republican. And Bryan is going to be calling for what he called free silver. In other words, they wanted what was called the bimetallic standard. Now, what this meant was that right now they're using the gold standard, right? Bimetallic, bi meaning two, metallic meaning metals, right? So they wanted the dollar to be tied to gold and silver. So by tying the dollar to gold and or silver, what this would do was inflate the currency. So William Jennings Bryan is calling for this, right? This is free silver, this bimetallic standard. And he's going to be condemning the gold standard using biblical language. He makes one of the most, famous speeches in American political history, the Cross of Gold speech. You will not crucify me on a cross of gold, right? And even though he's running as a Democrat, he's also going to carry the endorsement of the Populist Party. He was a champion. He championed the idea of the government helping ordinary Americans. This is how he's pitching himself. He was an adherent of the social gospel movement. If you remember, this is when Protestant ministers would go into the slums of urban areas and try to do things to help ameliorate the poverty there. And Bryant was really a contrast to the view with how business owners viewed things. Jennings is very much putting economic inequality, putting monetary policy in terms of morality, right? That this is immoral, which is something very different from the arguments we had been seeing up until this point. And even to this day, it's unusual to see, monetary policy being described in moral terms, even though monetary policy does carry moral consequences, right? So in the campaign of 1896, the Republicans nominated Ohio Governor William McKinley. And the election of 1896 is sometimes called the first modern presidential campaign because you're going to see industrialists and bankers pouring money into Republican coffers, all to counter Bryan's message. Because Bryan's message, again, was pitting this kind of naked self-interest in moral terms and contrasting it with the way things were. So McKinley's victory is going to shatter that political stalemate that had persisted since 1876. And it created one of the most enduring political majorities in American history. And it couldn't have been done without this enormous sums of money being poured in to back McKinley. And so now the country is really kind of going to be divided along regional lines, with Democrats controlling the South and the West, and Republicans controlling the North. And Republicans will keep power until the Great Depression, when everything kind of goes out the window. If you need to pause this video, please do so now. We're now going to talk about how the liberties of blacks after 1877 gave way to legal segregation across the South. So, in the South, after 1877, Reconstruction ends, and the Redeemers are now in power. So, Redeemers are going to be moving almost immediately to undo Reconstruction as much as possible. And they were a coalition of merchants, ex-enslavers, who are now, planters, landlords mostly, and business entrepreneurs who were in power after Reconstruction ends. So that's who this group is, right? Merchants, ex-enslavers, and business entrepreneurs. And really what they are trying to do is establish white supremacy and recreate as much as slavery as possible. That's the goal. Establish white supremacy and recreate as much slavery as they can. The public schools system that was established during Reconstruction is going to be the absolute hardest hit, both for whites and blacks. And it's crazy because at a time when throughout most of the country, literacy is steadily growing, slowly but surely, in Louisiana, for example, you actually see white illiteracy increase during this time. So it hits both whites and blacks. But of course, it's going to hit blacks harder, as their facilities were already underfunded, and this will make it even worse. They will be passing new laws that authorize the arrest of virtually any person without employment and greatly increase the penalties for petty crimes. Now, how does this tie into that? Well, guess who they're going to be targeting with these laws. Oh, you don't have a job, black person? Oh, you jaywalked, black person, right? And these people will then get arrested, and then prisons will hire out convicts for money. And so this becomes this new form of slavery, right? And these prison camps were by most accounts barbaric. You had extremely high death rates. And this was a way to re-enslave black males, especially, without having to re-enslave them, right? So this small group of redeemers, and it is a small group, like pretty much the same group that was in power before the Civil War is going to be in power after the Civil War, they will be profiting greatly in the South, largely on the backs of poor whites and African Americans. And the region as a whole is going to sink deeper and deeper into poverty. If there was economic inequality in the country everywhere, it was especially pronounced in the South. And it was intentional, right? It's not like this just happened magically in the South. This was intentionally done through policies. And the main selling point was that there were low wages, low taxes, because they're not spending taxes on the public good, and convict labor, right? So if you weren't one of those, redeemers in power, your chances for social mobility, black or white, were extremely limited. If you were poor in the South, chances are you would die poor in the South, right? And again, they did this on purpose. So one of the greatest cons that government has ever, certain members of government had ever perpetuated was that taxes are bad, right? Taxes are bad for rich people. Taxes are very, very good for middle class and poor people because those taxes are used for things that benefit middle class and poor people, right? Taxes are used to pay for middle class schools and schools for poor people. Rich people don't need that. They can hire a tutor, right? Taxes go to fund roads. Rich don't need it. They can take a helicopter. So the fact that taxes were low in the South was, put as a selling point, when in reality, that's one of the things that kept people poor, the fact that there was no taxes, no chances for upward mobility. If you need to pause this lecture, you can do so now. Okay. So poverty was pretty much endemic in the South. Only in Mobile, Alabama, was there a steel industry. Most southern cities were export centers for agricultural goods. They didn't really manufacture there. So the region is going to remain largely dependent on the North for capital and manufactured goods. And black people in the South were the most disadvantaged. Black farmers suffered the most from the region's condition. Now, in the Upper South, they did better because there was some industry in the Upper South. There was some land ownership in the Upper South. But in the Lower South, in the Deep South, blacks owned less land in 1900 than they had at the end of Reconstruction. And again, that doesn't happen by accident. There are policies in place to ensure that happens. Now, in the cities did support the growth of a small black middle class. And this middle class was supported by institutions created after the Civil War during Reconstruction, things like black colleges, black churches, black women's clubs, some black businesses. And so the black middle class, as it existed, was mostly professionals, right? Teachers, doctors, business owners, all that served the black community. But keep in mind, in society at large, African Americans were usually barred from skilled and supervisory positions. And so you might be allowed to work at a plant, but you would never be allowed to be a manager, for example. And you would become confined to unskilled, low-paid job, right? You could be the janitor. You couldn't be the boss. And so the labor market is going to remain rigidly segregated in this regard, both officially and unofficially. And this is true in the North, in the South, in the West. Keep in mind, too, that the few unions that did exist in the South also tended to exclude blacks. So even when there was a union, which was rare in the South, African Americans would largely be excluded from it. So as you can tell, the South isn't a very welcoming or free place for African Americans. So you do see some of them trying to go other places. One place that they tried to go was to Kansas, and this is commonly referred to as the Kansas Exodus. And this is when African Americans migrated to Kansas seeking political equality, freedom from violence, access to education, and economic opportunity. And this mostly occurs in 1879 and 1880. And it was largely promoted by real estate companies, right? Trying to sell land. You can see there an advertisement for it. And leaders such as Benjamin Pap Singleton. Benjamin Pap Singleton was an ex-slave who was kind of promoting this exodus to Kansas. The problem was most African Americans that ended up doing this lacked the capital to begin farms. And so they're going to end up as unskilled laborers in town. That being so, keep in mind, most African Americans didn't have that option. Most African Americans had little alternative but to stay in the South, but to stay where they were. And even when they did go north or go west, they are going to face very, very heavy discrimination. Most northern employers, for example, would refuse to offer jobs to blacks. They instead preferred white rural migrants or immigrants from Europe. So even if they had the means and the opportunity to leave the Jim Crow South, it didn't necessarily mean that their conditions were going to improve markedly. Though there's usually less violence, so there's that, but economically they're going to be dealing with a lot of roadblocks. So if you need to pause this video, you can do so now. So in Reconstruction, African Americans could and did vote. They were elected to local office, to state office, to national office. We even had a black senator. But slowly that starts to change. And this change doesn't happen overnight, but political opportunities became more and more restricted after 1877, after Reconstruction ended. And it won't be until the 1990s that the number of black legislatures in the South approaches Reconstruction levels. That's how long it takes to kind of recover. And as the doors to politics closed, more and more black men of talent turned away from politics since that door was open. So the banner of political leadership in many ways passed away from men and instead to black women activists. And the main group, one of the main groups that's going to be this vehicle is the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded in 1896. And this was black women who, this organization brought local and regional black women's clubs together and pressed for women's rights and racial uplift. And one of the things that they demanded was that black women be considered respectable, right? Because if black people in general are treated as second-class citizens, if you consider white women are second-class citizens now, imagine what black women are, right? So demanding that black women be considered as respectable as white women was really important, and in an attempt to combat their second-class citizenship. We do see gradually the disenfranchisement of African Americans. Now, in some states, we do see some biracial coalitions for a time that challenge democratic rule, and this, more than anything, is what prompts disenfranchisement. The fact that you know, the ruling elite were being challenged by these poor people, right? And so that is going to be what's kind of the impediments for this. So they can't just say black people can't vote because of that pesky 15th Amendment. But they will do things to get around this. And so between 1890 and 1906, every southern state will enact various laws or constitutional provisions specifically designed to eliminate the black vote. And so, again, the 15th Amendment prevents them from saying that's why they're doing this, but the net result will be the same. One thing that they did was they passed a poll tax. You can see an example of it there. This was a tax you had to pay to be allowed to vote. Um, Most African Americans were very poor, so they would not have been able to pay this. Most white people were very poor who may not have been able to pay this. Sometimes these poll taxes were aggregate. So, for example, say you didn't pay your poll tax in 1896. If you tried to pay your poll tax in 1897, you would owe for 1896 and 1887, right? There would also be literacy tests. You would have to go in and prove you could read. No, okay, fair enough. But keep in mind, this was not fairly administered. How can you, there were examples of Harvard graduates failing the literacy test. Sometimes you had to prove that you, quote, understood the state constitution. And again, as a professor, I can tell you, I can make a question so crazy that you can't answer it. And oftentimes, these restrictions would fall down on poor white people too. Many poor white people were disenfranchised by this. And sometimes that was fine. And sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes they wanted those poor white people to vote. So in that instance, they would pass what was called the Grandfather Clause. And this existed in 6 southern states until it was finally struck down for violating the 15th Amendment in 1915. And what the Grandfather Clause said was, if your grandfather could vote, then you would be exempt from these requirements, right? And of course, in 1890, right, most black people's grandparents were slaves, so they could not vote. So that's how they would get around this. So numerous poor and illiterate whites also lost the right to vote. Oftentimes this suited those ex-enslavers, those planters, just fine. More and more white people are becoming sharecroppers. And as late as 1940, only 3% of the adult black Southern population was registered to vote. This disenfranchisement is going to lead directly to the rise of a generation of Southern demagogues. And they would mobilize white voters by extreme appeal to racism. Because remember, one way that we define our freedom is by what we're not. So who is free? A white man is free. Who is not a white man? Not a white man is a black man. Therefore, a black man cannot be free, if this makes sense, right? And so the way that they'll get poor whites to vote against their own economic self-interest, to keep voting in these same corrupt politicians, is to appeal to racism. And so the elimination of black and many white voters, keep in mind, could not have been accomplished without the tacit approval of the North and the complicity of the Supreme Court. This is being done on the up and up. And so with that being said, what we're going to see is that Southern lawmakers wielded far greater power on the national scene than their electorate should have granted, right? They exercised power disproportionate to their importance and their percentage of the population. If you need to pause this video, you can do so now. So as we know, segregation is going to take hold in the South. This is, the white water fountain and the black water fountain, the white school and the black school. And there were some precedents for segregation in the pre-Civil War North and in various places during Reconstruction, but this was not across the board thing. It varied from place to place. It was kind of highly localized. And it was challenged in several Supreme Court cases. Collectively, we call these the Civil Rights cases in 1883, in which the Supreme Court invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 had outlawed racial discrimination in public facilities. So the Supreme Court says, no, you can do this. And of course, most famously, the court case that we kind of is kind of the segregation case is Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. In this case, the Supreme Court gave its approval to state laws requiring separate facilities for black and whites as long as they were, quote, equal. So this is why the shorthand for the Plessy case is separate but equal, right? Justice John Marshall Harlan was the lone dissenter on the court, and he warned the court that, quote, our Constitution is colorblind, unquote, and that segregation violated the principle of equal liberty. But alas, he was the only dissenter here. 8 out of the 9 justices approved this. So the states reacted to the Plessy decision by passing laws mandating racial segregation in almost every aspect of Southern life. In fact, the main reason why the United States doesn't have a universal health care system like literally every other industrialized country in the world is because of this issue of segregation. In the 1940s, it was Southern legislatures who were worried that this would lead to desegregated hospitals, and they blocked universal health care in an attempt to maintain segregation in the South. So this segregation had kind of horrific consequences, particularly for African Americans. For example, by 1900, 0 black high schools existed in the South. In other places, in California, for example, Asians were targeted for segregation. In Texas, Latinos were targeted with less success because technically Latinos are white, but attempts were made. Now, the point of this segregation wasn't so much to keep the races apart, because the races came into contact with each other all the time, right? Black people work for white people, that wasn't really the issue. This is really about power. It was ensuring that when the two groups came into contact with each other, whites held the upper hand. And so it is about white power, white supremacy. And so this became an all-encompassing system that kind of fed upon itself, right? Disenfranchisement led to unequal economic status, which led to inferior education, and all of this just kind of reinforces everything else. And remember, the average white person is also struggling in the South. 50% of them are sharecroppers. But the average white person will go along with this because this system let them be, quote, free, right? Because clearly African Americans were not free. And so no matter how wretched your life was as a white Southerner during this time period, and it was bad, you felt better about yourself because Black Bob over here had it so much worse. So you were free because Bob was not. Think of it like this. If I told you, dude, you just failed the test, you got a 50, you're probably going to feel pretty bad about yourself. But then if I said, but you got the highest grade in the class, your life still sucks, but you're better than everybody else. You feel better about it. That's kind of what's going on with poor whites and African Americans with this. Another thing that we see happening that kind of backs up all this is the rise of lynching. For those African Americans who sought to challenge this system or who refused to accept the demeaning behavior that was required of them in public life, they faced the very real threat of violence. Between 1883 and 1905, more than 50 people a year, mostly Black, were lynched in the South. In other words, murdered by the mob. And this is going to continue well into the 20th century. Now, you say 50 people a year, that's not very many, but keep in mind the power of lynching wasn't the number of people. It was the terror that it inspired, because these murders were oftentimes public, sometimes even advertised as a form of entertainment. And these people would be tortured, right? There's accounts of beatings and blowtorches and rapes and sodomy and just kind of dismemberment and horrible things. And nothing would happen to the perpetrators. If law enforcement wasn't specifically helping, they would definitely turn a blind eye. And so if you, as a Black person, know that somebody could, grab your mom and publicly rape her and cut off her fingers and burn her with blowtorches and nothing would happen to them, you're going to be very careful not to draw the ire, right? So it doesn't have to be a lot of people for lynching to be effective. The terror that it was meant to inspire is what made it such an effective tool. Lynching was especially guaranteed if it involved white womanhood, right? Many white Southerners considered preserving the, quote, purity of white womanhood as a justification for extra legal vengeance. So this again has less to do with women and more to do with preserving white patriarchy. And so you can see that there's this very real intersection between race and gender that is going to line up here. However, this excuse for, preserving white womanhood was very rarely true. And as Ida B. Wells explained, Ida B. Wells was a major anti-lynching advocate. You can see her book there. The charge of rape was usually, quote, a bare lie, right? Wells herself was born a slave in Mississippi in 1862. She later went on to become a teacher and an editor. And she moved to the North and became the nation's leading anti-lynching crusader. Sadly, even to this day, anti-lynching laws are still being hard to pass. If you need to pause this video to catch up, you may do so now. So we need to talk about the myth of the lost cause because it's alive and well. In the 1880s and the 1890s, keep in mind that the country is coming out of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the time period following the Civil War when the North is trying to reintegrate the rebel Southern states back into the country. And by the time we get to the 1880s, 1890s, the country was ready to reconcile. And in order to do that, we kind of reinvent what the Civil War was really about. Because in reality, slavery was the cause of the Civil War. It was all about slavery, okay? But that idea was problematic. And so the Civil War now is going to be reimagined, reinvented, and remembered as kind of this tragic family quarrel among Americans in which slavery played a very minor role, right? And so you're going to see this myth arise that this brother versus brother fight was for a noble cause, right? It was for the local rights of the South, that states' rights argument, that's what the South is fighting for, and it was for preservation of the Union for the North, right? That's what the North is fighting for, and it's really just kind of tragic that this happened, this misunderstanding. And so in this telling then, slavery becomes a minor issue, not the fundamental cause, when in reality, it was about slavery, right? But both sides, more the South than the North, but the North goes along with it, don't want this to be the story, okay? And so school history books are now going to change. They're going to be emphasizing, happy slaves. Slaves were happy and they were well treated and it was such a wonderful time, the Gone with the Wind romanticism of the South. And they're going to be harping down on the evils of Reconstruction with, quote, Negro rule. That it was Reconstruction when this poverty and inequality and misfortune befell upon the South, and everything was fine until then. And of course, if that's true, then the South is perfectly justified in undoing Reconstruction. Things like public education, things like voting rights for African Americans, this kind of thing. And so it's here where you start to see Southern governments erecting monuments to the quote lost cause. And that's this romanticized version of slavery, the Old South, the Confederate experience, um, turning it into something that it was not. And that remains to this day, right? And so religion played into this. Religion was central to this as it allowed Southerners to accept defeat without abandoning white supremacy, right? And we see this in the split in, for example, Northern and Southern churches, such as Northern Baptist and Southern Baptist, and they have yet to reconcile. And I think, you know, in recent years, we see this debate over, erecting or pulling down Confederate monuments. And I think the mayor of New Orleans, Mayor Mitch Landrieu, made a very, very powerful speech explaining why these monuments should in fact go down. And so I'm going to play part of his speech for you.
So today I want to speak about why we chose to remove these 4 monuments to the lost cause of the Confederacy, but also how and why this process can move us towards healing and understanding each other. It is self-evident that these men did not fight for the United States of America. They fought against it. They may have been warriors, but in this cause, they were not patriots. These statues are not just stone and metal. They're not just innocent remembrances of a benign history. These monuments celebrate a fictional, sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, ignoring the terror that it actually stood for. And after the Civil War, these monuments were part of that terrorism, as much as burning a cross on someone's lawn. They were erected purposefully to send a strong message to all who walked in the shadows about who was still in charge in this city. Another friend asked me to consider these 4 monuments from the perspective of an African-American mother or father trying to explain to their 5th grade daughter why Robert E. Lee sat atop of our city. Can you do it? Can you do it? Can you look into the eyes of this young girl and convince her that Robert E. Lee is there to encourage her? Do you think that she feels inspired and hopeful by that story? Do these monuments help her see her future with limitless potential? Have you ever thought that if her potential is limited, yours and my potential, my limited potential as well? We all know the answers to these very simple questions. When you look into this child's eyes is the moment when the searing truth comes into focus. This is the moment when we know what we must do, when we know what is right.
And so again, these monuments went up as a way to cement white supremacy. The lost cause was changing the narrative of what the Civil War was about in order to ensure white supremacy and in order to allow the Civil War to fade into memory, right? And so the past does become sanitized. They don't talk about the fact that under slavery, at any moment, the master could walk up to you and say, "Profits are low, hand me your baby," and sell it away, and you'll never see it again, right? The fact that master could rape you and you had no recourse. The fact that at any moment you could be whipped, your child whipped in front of you, and nothing be done. And so they don't talk about that, right? It suddenly becomes happy slaves and evil reconstruction. And again, it was all designed to ensure white supremacy. So if you need a moment to pause this video, you may do so now. So now we're going to talk about the ways the boundaries of American freedom grew narrower in the 1890s. So the late 19th century was very fractured in America. It was fractured along class lines, it was fractured along race lines, and because of that, we're going to see Americans kind of become obsessed with identifying and excluding those, quote, unworthy of liberty. Some people, in other words, deserve freedom, however you're defining it, and other groups did not. Um, the South, and kind of every region had the group that was not worthy of inclusion, right? In the South, African Americans are excluded. In the cities, you had immigrant slums are excluded, right? The West had the Chinese and the Japanese. And so, very much, this idea of freedom gets fractured, and clearly, certain Americans are identifying which groups are worthy of the blessings of liberty and which groups were not. One group that kind of is going to fall into that not category is immigrants to the United States. Sound familiar that we're having immigration debates? Again, a lot of parallels with the first Trump administration. So during this time period, historians talk about new immigrants. And we call them new immigrants to distinguish them from the immigrants that came before this time period. So before the 1880s and the 1890s, the older immigrants tended to come from Northern and Western Europe and China to a lesser extent. But beginning in the 1880s, new groups are coming, and a lot of them. In the 1890s, 3.5 million immigrants, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe, are going to be arriving in the United States. And they will be looking for jobs in industrial centers in the North and in the Midwest. And they are almost always viewed as inferior by native-born Americans. Partly this has to do with the fact that they are different than their predecessors, right? Their predecessors came from Northern and Western Europe, so, England, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, France, those kind of places. These groups are coming from, Italy, Greece, Russia, the Baltic areas, those types of places. They look different, their culture is different, their language is different. Many Jews are coming over, Catholics are coming over, so religion is different. And so they're very easy to be made into the other. So various suggestions are going to be made by nativists to eliminate immigrants' ability to vote. And there's lots of examples of this. For example, we have the creation of the Immigration Restriction League. This was founded in 1894 by a group of Boston professionals. And they sponsored a bill which would have barred, quote, illiterates from entering the United States. Now, that was vetoed, but you can see the push here, right? This idea that, contrary to what the Statue of Liberty says, send us your people yearning to breathe free, they're definitely trying to put some limits on that. If you need to pause this video, you can do so now. So the Chinese are going to be another group that are going to, in many ways, be deemed unworthy of liberty. Chinese are already facing discrimination on the West Coast in particular. Remember, around 75% of Chinese immigrants settled in California, but most of them are going to be on the West Coast. And so already they're facing a lot of discrimination, everything from, restrictions on property ownership to naturalization, everything else. Here you can see that this was rather accepted, right? Here's a washing machine company saying, if you don't want to be dirty, use this, right? And you can see Uncle Sam kicking out Chinese. So this kind of anti-Chinese bias, this fear of, quote, yellow peril, was very mainstream. So one move towards excluding the Chinese is going to be the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This barred Chinese from immigrating to the United States. Now, the Chinese were already barred from becoming naturalized citizens. So if you immigrated to the United States, you could never become a citizen. Now, your children could, right, because of that pesky 14th Amendment, but you could not. This act is going to cut off immigration from China. Now, the Chinese did, of course, resist the discrimination that they were facing, and they did fight for their rights in various ways. In fact, photographs for identification purposes, like your driver's license, you have a photograph, this came into effect as a way of enforcing Chinese exclusion, right? So, I mean, it has kind of this history. But the Chinese people did fight back. And so we do have a series of court cases talking about this. So Chinese people are going to be demanding equal rights, and these court cases will be up to the Supreme Court. And you're going to see the Supreme Court defining the reach of the 14th Amendment in these cases. One of the important court cases is Tate versus Hurley in 1885. In this case, the California Supreme Court ordered the city to admit Chinese students to the public schools. In response to that, the state responded by passing a law authorizing segregated education, and that will be in effect until 1947 when it gets overturned. We also see the United States versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898. This one was a win, if you will, for Chinese people. In it, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment did award citizenship to children of Chinese immigrants born on American soil. And then in Fong Yu Ting versus United States, this authorized the federal government to expel Chinese aliens without due process of law. So that's a hit for the Chinese people. If you need to pause this video, you can do so now. So these groups that are deemed by white Anglo-Saxon male society to be unworthy didn't necessarily just take it. They do fight back with varying degrees of success. For African Americans, one prominent leader is Booker T. Washington. He is one of several prominent black leaders who were emphasizing economic self-help and individual advancement into the middle class as an alternative to political agitation. This is not a time of marches or sit-ins or confrontation yet. Still, it's much more moderate than that, and you can kind of understand why. Remember, the African Americans that would have been alive during this time period, most of them would have had firsthand experience with slavery, either themselves or at the very least their parents. So within their lifetime, they have already seen radical change. So it kind of helps to explain why maybe African Americans aren't being as militant or confrontational as they will be, in another 50 years or so. But keep in mind that this idea of, emphasizing economic self-help, of emphasizing pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get into the middle class, keep in mind that this is in the context of how business leaders had defined American freedom in the Gilded Age, right? Remember, if American freedom meant the freedom of contract, right, being able to work and not being interfered with, of the ability to get rich and make money, right? This argument of pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get into the middle class that black leaders are making is very much in line with that definition. And case in point of this is Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech in 1895, in which he urged black Americans to adjust to segregation and abandon agitation for civil and political rights. In other words, accommodate yourself. Oftentimes this is referred to as an accommodation policy, right? Accommodate yourselves to segregation and quit causing trouble, basically. And instead, he urged blacks not to try to combat segregation, and instead, work on education and entrance into the middle class. So Washington emphasized vocational education, which was, educational training for a job rather than for broad learning, over political equality. He's going to be talking about economic self-help rather than, social justice. And so, unsurprisingly, he's going to gain a lot of white support, but he does also gain a lot of black support, right? And again, this is very much in line with definitions of freedom that were operational in the Gilded Age. We do also have labor fighting back. You see this in particular with the rise of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. This is a labor union that largely is going to replace the Knights of Labor after the Knights of Labor kind of fell from grace after the Haymarket Square riot. And the rise of the AFL reflected a shift away from the reformist past to one of more limited goals, right? In the past, you would see labor unions wanting to kind of reform society in a broad sense. And now they're going to be shifting to kind of small, kind of obtainable, limited goals. And partly this was a response to the outcome of the Homestead and the Pullman strikes. These strikes that were very big, wherein the state came in and used violence to put these strikes down, largely showed labor that direct confrontation with corporation was literally suicidal, right? I mean, you would literally be killed for that. And so many of them opted, to stop doing that. And so the leader of the AFL, which by the way is still around today, it's called the AFL-CIO today, the leader was a man named Samuel Gompers. And Gompers pioneered something he called, quote, business unionism. Business unionism. This was not the Knights of Labor corporative commonwealth, kind of the opposite of that. So instead of trying to kind of reform the nature of labor in America, they instead began negotiating for specific things. Specifically, they would be negotiating for higher wages and for better working conditions. And they're going to be using the same language and vocabulary as American business leaders. They will adopt American business leaders' ideas of freedom instead of the other earlier ideas of freedom labor was fighting for. This idea that freedom meant having economic security and some degree of autonomy, right? Instead, they're going to be adopting this language of contract, this language of, unregulated capitalism as this definition of freedom. And so in the 1890s, the labor movement is going to become less and less inclusive. Unlike the Knights of Labor, which tried to organize almost everybody, right? Skilled and unskilled, men, women, white, black, the AFL is going to be highly restricted. Its members are going to be male, they're going to be white, and they're going to be skilled workers. So labor unions become less inclusive. Women are also going to kind of fight back, but kind of not, right? In some areas, you can see that women's movements during this era will reflect this idea of expanding activities, but also narrowing the boundaries. Because women are going to enjoy larger opportunities than in the past for economic independence, and they will play a greater role in public life. But what role that is in many ways going to be still limited to what was considered, quote, proper for women during this time period. So this is not the era of feminism yet. So women are going to be coming into the public sphere more than before, but they're going to be tying their public sphere activities to their private sphere responsibilities in many instances. So through networks of women's clubs, through temperance associations, through social reform organizations, women will exert a growing influence on public affairs. You see this, for example, with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, which was started in 1874 and led by a woman named Frances Willard. And this is going to grow to become the era's largest female organization. And they will campaign under the banner of, quote, home protection, right? That's the blanket term for the reforms that they wanted. And it included everything from prohibition to, suffrage, right? And one of the things that they did was they tried to argue against seeing weakness and dependence as their nature. There was very much this belief about the fundamental nature of men and the fundamental nature of women that was commonly accepted during this time period. And one of the things that was just kind of accepted as true was that women, by their very nature, were weak, by their very nature, were dependent, by their very nature, were emotional, not logical. And remember, this is the reason, part of the reason for these definitions is that this is a patriarchal society, right? Men were in charge, so men got to make the definitions. So one of the ways that you define yourself is by what you're not. So if men want to see themselves as strong, as men want to see themselves as independent, as they want to see themselves as logical and intelligent, well, in order to set yourself up as that, you need to have your opposite, right? You need to have what you're not. So what is not a man? A man is not a woman. So if men get to be all these things, right? Logical and strong and independent, then women by definition have to be weaker, dependent, illogical, this kind of stuff. And so, and it has to be that way to maintain patriarchy, right? If you undo that, then patriarchy has to fall. How can the man be above women if women are not fundamentally everything a man is not, right? If they are in fact equal, then patriarchy collapses. So these organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Movement, even though it doesn't sound like they're trying to do anything radical, what they are in fact is proposing is ultimately an end to patriarchy, which in and of itself is highly, highly radical for its time. And we're still not there yet, right? So the center of gravity of feminism is going to shift toward an outlook more in keeping with prevailing racial and ethnic norms. We're going to see middle-class educated women demanding it as members of a superior race, right? And we're going to see, calls for suffrage. And again, this is going to be coming, instead of trying to define these things, these rights in terms of gender, which was how it was being denied to these white women, they're going to be trying to claim these rights on the basis of their race and on the basis of their class, which, again, we mentioned earlier about African American women's organizations, why their calls for being considered respectable are so very important during this time period. So we do have some suffrage organizations demanding the right to vote, right? Such as NASA is probably the most important, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This was created in 1890 and led by Carrie Chapman Catt. And again, they're going to be demanding this right to vote as members of a superior race, as members of the middle class. And adding to their argument was the fact that, hey, immigrants can vote, why can't I, right? Former slaves can vote, why can't I? As far as women's suffrage is concerned, until the 19th Amendment, it will be determined on a state-by-state basis. So in some states, women are voting, in some states they are not. Typically, women could vote in the West, but could not vote in the North or the South. Okay, if you need to pause this video, you can do so now. All right, finally, we're going to discuss how the United States emerged as an imperial power in the 1890s. So America today is an empire. We don't like to call ourselves that because empire denotes kind of asymmetrical power and brute force, and it makes us feel kind of icky. But just ask the people of Puerto Rico. We are an empire, and we have been since the 1890s. Now, imperialism is, the building and maintaining of an empire is what that means. And keep in mind that there's kind of two different types of power. There's hard power and there's soft power. So the American empire today is much larger than just the direct territory we control directly, like Puerto Rico and Guam, right? Our empire extends to countries we don't officially control, but indirectly have power over. And that goes down to hard and soft power. So hard power is what it sounds like. this is typically force, right? Military power. I go in, I conquer you, I occupy you. That's hard power. We did this in Iraq, for example. We did this in Afghanistan. That's the use of hard power and imperialism. More typical, what the United States does today and even here, is the use of soft power. Soft power is the fact that, it's not the direct use of force, but it's because your economy is so strong, your culture is so superior, you have so much clout that you can make a country do what you want them to do without having to go over and directly take them over. So, for example, if the United States tells Mexico, you need to combat drugs, Mexico turns itself inside out trying to combat drugs. We didn't have to go over and take it over, right? We had enough power that we could compel Mexico to do what we wanted it to do without having to do that. That's an example of soft power. So, to put this in context, what's going on in the 1890s, you need to understand what the world looks like, because this is getting into international stuff. In the 1880s, America was a second-rate power. We are far from the superpower that we are today. Our military was virtually non-existent. Our Navy was very, very weak. We didn't have any overseas possessions. And this is, especially egregious when you contrast it with what's going on in Europe and Japan. After 1870, European powers, along with the Japanese, are in a mad scramble to dominate Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. They're gobbling up this territory as quickly as they can. And they're almost always going to be justifying this imperialism as bringing, quote, civilization, unquote, to the supposedly backward people of the non-European world. Now, for America, we are not doing that in the 1870s or 1880s in Africa, Asia, or the Middle East. Not necessarily because we don't want to, but we're kind of busy fighting a civil war, and, we're busy at home conquering Native Americans. And that is textbook imperialism, right? Conquering other people and taking their land. So territorial expansion had always been a part of American life since well before independence. Just ask the Native Americans. But it won't be until the 1890s where we see this significant shift in America's relationship with the rest of the world. And it's, again, not because we were more enlightened, but it's only in the 1890s where we finally have conquered Native Americans, we finally conquered our own continent, and we're kind of in a position socially, economically, politically to exert our power overseas. And so America's slightly different than what's going on in Europe, right? Most Europeans are interested in colonizing places. Most Americans during this time period who look overseas weren't necessarily interested in territorial possessions, but were more interested in expanded trade. But there's lots of different reasons why America is going to expand. Again, the main reason is going to be this reason for trade. They're wanting markets for their surplus goods. This is particularly true after the economic depressions in the 1870s and the 1890s. So the ability to sell in overseas markets, to have access to overseas resources is going to be very attractive for a lot of Americans. Another reason for Americans getting involved in this is religious missionaries. Religious missionaries will be spreading the nation's influence overseas during the late 19th century. This was really inspired by a Methodist minister by the name of Dwight Moody. He led a group called Student Volunteer Movement for Foreign Missions, and this group was dedicated to spreading Christianity, helping the poor, and preparing for the second coming of Christ, right? This was a group to this day that these kinds of groups are around that believe the second coming of Christ is imminent, that we're in the end times, and that, you have to prepare for this. This, for example, is why the American evangelical movement is such a strong supporter of Israel. Not because these evangelicals are particularly sympathetic to Jewish people, but because according to their reading of biblical prophecy, Jews have to control Israel before the second coming of Christ can happen, and they're trying to hurry that along. So that's an example of this. And you do have a small group of late 19th century thinkers who are actively going to be promoting American expansionism. Probably one of the most important ones is Alfred T. Mann. Alfred T. Mann wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890. And he argued that no nation could prosper without a large fleet of ships engaged in international trade and protected by a navy with overseas bases. And this particular line of thinking is going to be highly influential for American secretaries of state who are going to be interested in territories, such as James G. Blaine, who was Secretary of State, who actively promoted seizing Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Now, Hawaii was long sought after by individual Americans, and it will eventually be annexed by the United States in 1898. Before that, Hawaii was a monarchy, and its economy was dominated by American-owned sugar plantations. So it was its own country. It had a queen at the time, but a lot of Americans owned sugar plantations and were invested in the island. Now, early in 1893, Americans on the island decided to try to overthrow the monarchy and get Hawaii annexed by the United States. So they organized a rebellion and overthrew the queen. Her name was Queen Lulukalani. There you can see her being escorted after she was imprisoned after the coup. After these Americans overthrew the queen, they form a provisional government and they petitioned the United States for annexation. It was during this time period that American officials who were investigating this discovered that most Hawaiians did not want to be annexed by the United States. And so America withdrew its offer of annexation. And so for about 5 years or so, Hawaii's kind of floating around under this provisional government. It won't be until the Spanish-American War in 1898 that Americans rediscovered how useful Hawaii's strategic position was, and decided to annex it anyway, right in the middle of the Spanish-American War. And so that is going to kind of correspond more or less with a depression that's happening in the 1890s. And that depression, along with the kind of geopolitical things that are happening, are going to kind of heighten the belief that a more aggressive foreign policy was necessary to help stimulate American exports, to kind of, get the United States to be on par with the great world powers, but most especially for trade. And so beginning in the 1890s, we begin to kind of see manufactured patriotism to try to gin up support for these overseas conquests. And so this is being manufactured, right? It is being created. And you see it through things like the use of the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, right? Why do we have to stand up and put our hand over our heart when they play this song? Well, part of the reason is they are creating patriotism, right? If patriotism was true, you would feel inspired to do it without any social expectation of it, right? You would just happen naturally. But it doesn't, right? You are expected to stand up and put your hand over your heart. And if you don't, there are social consequences for it, right? That is manufacturing patriotism. You also see the press kind of playing along with this. Things like the yellow press are happening. Yellow journalism is where they would be publishing sensationalized accounts of things with little regard to fact or logic, right? And that gets harnessed in the use of patriotism. And we see it with William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. We see it with Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. All these guys are going to be guilty of that. And of course, yellow journalism is going to be one of the main things that is going to propel us into the the Spanish-American War of 1898. If you need to pause this video, you can do so now. Okay, so let's talk about the Spanish-American War of 1898. So this whole thing starts because of Cuba. So Cuba was a Spanish colony and had been for centuries at this point. By the time we get to 1895, Cubans want independence from Spain. And so in 1895, Cuba is waging a revolution trying to kick the Spanish out. The Spanish, for their part, don't want to go. They are desperately trying to cling to one of their few remaining colonies in the New World, and they're fighting back. And they're using really, really brutal tactics, right? They're doing collective punishment. They have, concentration camps, all these things. Now, this affected Americans in a couple ways. One was that because of the proximity, a lot of Cuban refugees are coming into the United States and they're telling these stories, right? And if you were to ask your average American during this time period, who do you side with, the Cubans or the Spaniards? They would say the Cubans, right? So they have a sympathetic American public to their plight. The second reason is that American businesses are heavily invested in Cuba, particularly in plantations and agriculture. And war is bad for business. And even if the Cubans do win, right, what kind of government do they put in? Are they going to put in a government that is friendly to American business? So for these reasons, Americans care what's happening in Cuba. Now, this is going to be heightened by that yellow journalism we just talked about. Newspapers are going to be seizing these accounts by Cubans, which admittedly are bad, but they're going to amp them up, right? They're going to be, exaggerating things. They're going to be blowing things out of proportion. They're going to, sensationalize stuff. And they're going to be amping up calls for American intervention into this conflict in Cuba. Now, McKinley, who is president at the time, does not want to intervene in Cuba. But he is an elected official, and more pressure is being mounted for him to do something. And so in 1898, McKinley decides to do the absolute bare minimum, and he's going to do what America still does today, right? When anytime something froggy happens, he decides to send a battleship, the USS Maine, down to Havana Harbor. Now, the Maine is not actually supposed to do anything, right? They're basically just supposed to float there and, provide moral support for the Cuban people, basically. Look at my guns. I could intervene if I want to. And the United States still does this, right? Watch the news, and, sometimes something will happen in the Straits of Hormuz, or maybe something happens in the South China Sea, and America will send a battle group over there whenever, a battleship and our battleships and an aircraft carrier, a carrier group will send it to the region. And they're not supposed to do anything, right? They're just supposed to float there and say we could do something if we wanted to. So anyways, this is what McKinley does. He sends the Maine down, and then all of a sudden, bam, the Maine explodes. And they didn't know why, right? Was there an accident? Did it hit a sea mine? Was it torpedoed by the Spaniards? They didn't know. But remember the type of journalism that's being practiced. The headline wasn't, "The Maine explodes, it's a mystery." The headline was, "Spain attacked us. Oh my God, Spain has attacked us. Remember the Maine, remember the Maine, remember the Maine." And remember the Maine becomes the battle cry of the Spanish-American War, just like remember the Alamo does for the Texas Revolution, right? Now, it turns out 100 years later, historians and forensic scientists found the wreckage of the USS Maine in the Havana Harbor, and they've driven down and they've inspected it, and it turns out the reason why the Maine exploded was actually an accident on board. Remember, this is a steamship. The coal got lit. It lit off the ammo, and bam, right? But they don't know that for 100 years. In the meantime, Spain gets blamed for this. And so after this happens, the United States, that's going to be the thing that pushes the United States into the war, right? McKinley couldn't stay out of it after this. And so the United States is going to go to war with Spain with the declared purpose of winning Cuba's liberty and freedom. That is what we said we were fighting for, to free Cuba. And to kind of back this up, America passed the Teller Amendment. In the Teller Amendment, the United States declared that it had no intention of annexing or dominating the island. And as far as these things go, the Spanish-American War is going to be an overwhelming success for the United States. It is relatively painless. There are very few casualties. It's over lightning fast for 19th century standards. So much so that the Secretary of State, John Hay, declares this to be a, quote, splendid little war. Now, even though this is technically about Cuba, that's not actually where the first fighting will take place. The first fighting in the Spanish-American War is going to take place half a world away in the Spanish-owned Philippines. And the reason why is that, remember, when you go to war with an empire, you don't just go to war with the mother country. You go to war with the mother country and all their colonies. So the Philippines were owned by the Spaniards. Much like Cuba, there's a guerrilla war going on to try to kick the Spaniards out. And the Secretary of the Navy, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was Teddy Roosevelt. And as he saw events heating up with Spain, he sent a standing order to the commander of our Pacific Fleet. His name was George Dewey. And he told Dewey that if war breaks out with Spain, Dewey was to immediately attack the Spanish in the Philippines. And so when war broke out, Dewey set sail from Hong Kong, and in a sneak attack on May 1st, he will destroy the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay. Now, at first, the Filipinos, who again were trying to kick the Spanish out themselves, were really happy to see the United States. They assumed that because the United States was fighting for Cuba's quote-unquote freedom, that we would be fighting for Filipino freedom too. Spoiler alert, doesn't work out the way they think it will, okay? Meanwhile, in Cuba itself, the fighting is very, very quick. An important, well, not an important, a notable thing I should tell you about is Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. Now, understand, Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders are not important, okay? We win the Spanish-American War whether this group exists or not. But they are famous, and so I have to tell you about them because they are famous, not because they are important. So here's what happened. Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of Navy. You see him there in the middle. When war broke out, he decided that he needed to be, quote, manly, that's his favorite word, literally, and join the army. And so he quits his job and creates a volunteer cavalry company that he commands, and that volunteer cavalry company is called the Rough Riders. And so he gets them together, and they go down to Cuba to fight. The main battle they fight on is at San Juan Hill, where they're victorious. And again, they're not important, okay? We win, whether they exist or not, but they are famous. The main reason why this matters is because Teddy knew how to play the press. And so he is going to emerge from the Spanish-American War as kind of this national hero. And he is going to ride that celebrity to be elected governor of New York. And then in 1900, he will become vice president under McKinley. And of course, McKinley gets assassinated, so he slides into the presidency after that. So it's here where Teddy Roosevelt becomes famous and is able to translate that into political office. Now, after America is victorious in the Spanish-American War, we get a lot of territory. We get the Philippines, we get Puerto Rico, and we get Guam, all as part of the treaty settlement. And remember, the Filipinos were hoping that America would be fighting for their freedom too. But McKinley became convinced that the United States could not return the Philippines to Spain or set them free. And the argument that he gave was that the Filipinos were, quote, not ready yet, unquote. And so he's going to be justifying keeping the Philippines as we're getting them ready for independence, that we're civilizing them, when in reality, you know, this is a territory grab. Now, the treaty with the Spanish-American War is going to grant the United States the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and the Pacific island of Guam, and it also did grant independence to Cuba. But America's relationship with Cuba is not going to be what was set out in the Teller Amendment, because the United States now recognized that it had an interest in ensuring that whatever Cuba's government is going to be, that government is friendly to the United States. And so the United States will pass the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment will replace the Teller Amendment. And the Platt Amendment authorized the United States to intervene militarily in Cuba whenever it saw fit. And they do this several times before the First World War, all to keep in place a government that's not so nice to the Cuban people, but definitely nice to American commercial interests. America will also get a permanent naval base in Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. This is Gitmo, which we still have to this day. And keep in mind that these new possessions that we have, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, they have more to do with trade and gaining wealth from American resources than they do from large-scale American settlement, right? Americans aren't moving, by and large, to these places. This is more about having access to their markets or using them as way stations to bigger markets like China. And speaking of China, one other thing I need to mention, because it becomes important, particularly with regard to World War II, is the open door policy with China. And that very much ties into this American demand for trade. So let me explain what's going on in China. China, during this time period, is very, very weak. There is a Chinese government. It does exist, but it's a very weak government. And there are large parts of the country where the government doesn't really exercise a lot of control. There are large parts of the country that are controlled by warlords, for example. But within China, particularly along the coast, what's happened with European powers and Japan is that China has been carved up into what are called spheres of influence. Spheres of influence. And what this means is that in a particular sphere, every country had its own sphere, right? Germany had one, Russia had one, England had one, France had one, Japan had one. And within that sphere, say it was the British sphere of influence, in that territory, both the British and the Chinese government would share governance of that territory, to make things simple. So the Chinese government's still there, it still exists, but in large parts of the country, they exercise either no control or nominal control or limited control, okay? And so this is what's going on in China. Now, the United States really would like to have its own sphere of influence, but it can't. It's too weak to get one in China. And so what the open door policy demanded was that European powers that had a commercial sphere of influence in China grant equal access to American exports. In other words, if you have a sphere of influence, fine, but let us do business in them too. And this is how America was hoping to benefit from Chinese trade without having to exercise that hard power. And sometimes countries let this go and sometimes they didn't. It depended on the country and the time and the place. But this becomes important when we start talking about what's going on, in World War II with China. Okay, if you need to pause this video, you can do so now. So, to get back to the Philippines, McKinley has decided, okay, the United States will not set the Philippines free and it will not return them. Now, this is going to lead to the Philippine War, which takes place from 1899 to 1903. Now, many Americans believed that American participation in the destruction of Spanish rule would lead to social reform and to political self-government. But America insisted on maintaining control in the Philippines until, that happened. The Filipinos had been fighting Spain since 1896. The nationalist leaders in the Philippines was a man named Emilio Aguinaldo. And once America took Spain's place, he turned his guns on America, fighting against American colonization. And the second war, this Philippine War, is going to be much longer and much bloodier than the Spanish-American War was. Now, the McKinley administration justified U.S. intervention in the Philippines on the grounds that the aim was to, quote, uplift and civilize and Christianize the Filipinos, unquote. Now, interestingly, Spain had been there a long time. Many Filipinos were Catholic, but whatever, okay? And the United States did begin to modernize the island. America did go in there and begin building schools and colleges and infrastructure. That being said, remember the reason why America took the Philippines in the first place. It was for commercial reasons. And so the downside of this was that it left an enduring legacy of poverty to the majority of the rural population because we wanted to sell them our stuff. So we didn't let them create businesses and manufacturing, right? They could create raw materials. They could create farm materials. And so after America leaves, we don't leave them with this economic infrastructure in place, right? So in many ways, we condemn them to poverty. You also have to ask yourself, how can we be civilizing this group of people what does that mean? And, are we really that civilized ourselves when you have lynching, for example? And so there were a lot of atrocities that were committed in this war. You can see here, for example, the order to kill everyone over 10. You can see the picture of little children being shot when Jacob H. Smith ordered his soldiers to kind of massacre this village. There were examples of, water torture being used against each other. So really bad stuff happened in this war, and America did really bad things in this war that we kind of don't want to talk about and forget. So in the end, Aguinaldo recognized that the Filipinos could not defeat America. He is going to agree to a ceasefire, and the Philippines will remain an American protectorate until Japan takes it from us in World War II, and then we get it back, and then they gain independence in 1946. But it was an uneasy relationship for quite a long time. So with America's new territories, now the question is, are the people of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, are they citizens or are they subjects? And this is going to be complicated by the fact that American rule also brought with it American racial attitudes. And American racial attitudes kind of can be summed up by Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, right? When Kipling argued that the domination of non-white people by whites is what was helping civilization progress, right? That he's arguing that white Christian civilization was superior, and that white Christians had an, quote, obligation to, quote, civilize other browner people, right? And so this is very much how many Europeans at the time and many Americans viewed taking over these poorer, usually browner countries, that it was their responsibility to, quote, civilize them, to make them just like white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. Now, this is very much paternalism in action, right? This idea of, these poor, stupid Filipinos, let me teach them democracy. Let me teach them the correct way to run an economy. They could never figure this out on their own. And paternalism remains a staple of American foreign policy to this day. When we take over Iraq and say we're going to teach them democracy, what we're really saying is, you poor, stupid Iraqis can't figure out democracy for yourselves. Let us take you over and show you the correct way to behave, right? This is paternalism in action. And make no mistake, there were some people who, in their heart of hearts, thought they were doing a good thing, right? And in some ways it's kind of tragic, because in their hearts they were good people trying to do good things. But in many ways it was misguided, right? So, in any event, America's Entry into the ranks of imperial powers is going to spark this intense debate over the relationship between political democracy, race, American citizenship, because for a very long time, nationalism, democracy, freedom had become identified with notions of Anglo-Saxon superiority. So, what does this mean for a group that is specifically not, Anglo-Saxon and can make no pretenses to it? That falls. That's creating the anxiety and the tension here. And so, we see that racism ultimately is going to win out here. First, in the Foraker Act of 1900, which declared Puerto Rico to be a, quote, insular territory. In other words, different from the previous territories in the West. In previous territories in the West, before parts of the West became states, it was always understood that this territory was destined for statehood and that its people were destined for American citizenship. In the Foraker Act, we are specifically saying that Puerto Rican people were not U.S. citizens and that Puerto Rico was not destined for statehood. And the same applied to the Philippines. And this will be upheld in the Supreme Court cases that are collectively called the insular cases from 1901 to 1904. In the insular cases, the Supreme Court held that the Constitution did not fully apply to the territories recently acquired by the United States. And so it's interesting because it's here at the turn of the century that we see all those old traditions that America was supposedly founded on, right? This idea of no taxation without representation, this idea of government by the consent of the governed, are just completely thrown out the window when it applied to these colonial possessions. In fact, even the Constitution is thrown out the window, right? We're saying it doesn't apply to you. And so it's a complete 180, which kind of demonstrates that these notions of what it means to be American, what American values are, what the country stands for, it's never been firm, right? It's always been flexible and situational. So in the 20th century, the territories that were acquired in 1898 would follow different paths. Eventually, Hawaii achieved statehood in 1959, as we talked about. The Philippines will gain independence in 1946. But Puerto Rico, as we know, is still part of the United States. It's called the world's oldest colony and is still governed as a commonwealth, despite the fact that Puerto Rico has voted a couple times for U.S. citizenship. That still has not been extended to them. And so keep in mind that these American racial attitudes are going to have a global impact in the age of empire. What we will begin to see develop is this kind of global sense of fraternity among, quote, Anglo-Saxon nations. So these countries will see themselves as, comrades in arms, as brothers. Specifically the United States, Great Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, right? Even today, we share, for example, a special espionage intelligence relationship with those countries. We call it the Five Eyes, where we just basically cooperate on spying with each other. That special relationship traces, in part, its history back to this kind of racial solidarity that we recognized at the turn of the century. And so we will see American laws influencing other countries, right? For example, the Chinese exclusion law in the United States will influence anti-Chinese law adopted in Canada. American segregation and disenfranchisement become models for Australia and for South Africa. And so it mattered, right? Social Darwinist attitudes will eventually, and laws will eventually influence Nazi Germany. What the United States did echoed around the world. And ultimately, America had to ask itself, are you a republic or are you an empire? Now, there was some pushback against the empire, and probably the most prominent organization that did that was called the Anti-Imperialist League. And the Anti-Imperialist League had some pretty prominent people in it, Mark Twain, William Jennings Bryan, And it argued that empire was incompatible with democracy, that you can't say it's ruled by the people if you're, took over another country by force and are making its people be your citizens, whether, or not even citizens, making your people be subject to your rule of law without them having a say, right? So some argued that. Some anti-imperialists were just racist, did not want these other races or ethnicities in the American empire. And others felt like we should focus at home. We had enough problems at home. We don't need to be building schools in the Philippines. We need to be building schools in, Mississippi. So there's lots of different motivations behind why somebody might be an anti-imperialist. But they are a minority. Most Americans are going to be okay with these imperialist endeavors. And without any sense of contradiction, proponents of an imperial foreign policy would also be adopting the language of freedom when they were describing it, right? They would describe America as a benevolent empire, that America was spreading freedom, that America was spreading liberty, without any sense of irony. All right, so this concludes this lecture.